Hi everyone, this is my next video in my name credentials video series, and in this video we will talk about how to implement oAuth 2.0 flow using name credentials. We have already seen how to implement basic authentication and custom authentication using name credentials in my previous videos, and in custom authentication video I also explained how does name credentials work, right? If I go to my org, if I go to my setup, search for name credentials here, go to name credentials, you see tabs like name credentials, external credentials, right? So what are external credentials? What is name credentials? All of this, I have explained in my custom authentication video. If you want, you can have a look at it. All right. Now, if I click on new on external credentials, you see there's a section called authentication protocol. If I select this, you see a lot of authentication protocols here, right? Out of which we have already covered custom authentication and basic authentication. And now we are about to cover oAuth 2.0 flow, right? And in this, you can see a lot of authentication flow types as well, right? So we'll cover each one of them one by one. We'll start with the browser flow first, okay? Now in this video, I first want to explain what actually is oAuth 2.0 flow, right? Because if you want to understand how to implement oAuth 2.0 flow using name credentials, first you should know what is oAuth 2.0 flow. Only then we can effectively implement and understand how to implement it using name credentials, right? And for that, first we need to understand how the systems used to communicate to each other, or how the applications used to communicate to each other before oAuth 2.0 flow was introduced. What I mean to say is, what was the need for introducing oAuth 2.0 flow, right? So in this video, you can call it part 1 of oAuth 2.0 flow using name credentials. In this video, I will just explain what is exactly oAuth 2.0 flow, all right? Now to understand oAuth 2.0 flow, we need to understand what was there before oAuth 2.0 flow was introduced. So we'll understand that with an example, okay? Let's consider this example on my screen. So there is a user called Aniket, okay? And that user uses two online services. One is mybudget.com and one is mybank.com. What is mybudget.com? It is an online service, or rather a website, which will help Aniket to prepare a monthly budget based on his salary and his expenses. All right. And what is mybank.com? Mybank.com is nothing but the bank where Aniket has his account, where his salary gets credited and where he does all the transactions, and all the transactions get recorded in this website. So these are two websites. Mybudget.com is one website and mybank.com is one website. All right. And do note, guys, these are not actual websites. These are just hypothetical websites which I'm using in my example. All right. The user Aniket has account in both the websites. So in mybudget.com, his credentials are this. Let's assume the credentials are this. And in mybank.com, the credentials are this, right? Now, in order for mybudget.com to be able to prepare a monthly budget for Aniket, what information does mybudget.com need? It will need information like how much salary gets credited in Aniket's bank account. And then in addition to that, it will also need information like details of all the transactions which Aniket makes, right, in a given month. So based on the salary getting credited and all the transactions being made in a particular month, mybudget.com can prepare a monthly budget for user Aniket, right? Now this website, mybudget.com, in order to prepare the monthly budget for user Aniket, somehow needs access to Aniket's detail in this bank website, right? So this bank website might have a lot of users registered. One of them will be Aniket, right? So for this website, mybudget.com, to be able to prepare the monthly budget for Aniket, this website somehow needs to have access of the account details of user Aniket. Now, how all this will work? Let's assume this is the login URL for the website mybank.com, www.mybank.com/login. So if Aniket wants to access his account details in mybank.com, he would go to this URL and enter his username and password, and he can access his account details, right? Now, Aniket can directly access his account details in this website using his credentials, right? But how will Aniket let this website, mybudget.com, access his details in this website? How will that happen? Now, how this scenario will play out without oAuth 2.0? The way it would work is, this website, mybudget.com, will already have the information of login URL or login endpoint of mybank.com. And not just mybank.com. It will have information of all relevant banks in which people might have accounts. So mybudget.com will have that information. And when user Aniket logs in his mybudget.com account, he might see some button or some call to action. For example, it could be retrieve my bank details, right? So there could be some button or call to action. And when Aniket clicks on that button or takes action on that call to action, ultimately what mybudget.com is looking for is, mybudget.com is looking for Aniket's credential for his account in this website. Because if mybudget.com gets Aniket's credential of his account in this website, it can use it to fetch details of Aniket's account in mybank.com. So how will this play out? So when Aniket logs in into mybudget.com, he will click that button or call to action. So as soon as he clicks that button, one of the ways could be that mybudget.com will prompt or show a pop-up or prompt Aniket to enter his credentials. Which credentials? This credential, the credential of Aniket's account in mybank.com, right? So Aniket will enter his credentials of mybank.com in mybudget.com, and mybudget.com will use that credential to connect to mybank.com and get access to Aniket's record. And how this connection was established? So before oAuth 2.0 was introduced, one of the ways was that services like mybank.com would expose an endpoint to an API, right? And services like mybudget.com could invoke that API with users' credentials as parameters, okay? And if the user's credentials are correct, then mybank.com would give access of Aniket's record to mybudget.com. So this was one of the ways. There were other ways as well in which mybudget.com could access Aniket's record in mybank.com. But irrespective of the mechanism, the common thing in all those mechanisms was that Aniket as a user has to share his credentials with mybudget.com. Which credential? His account in mybank.com. Those credentials Aniket has to share with mybudget.com. All right. And once services like mybudget.com have your sensitive information like your username and password of your bank account, I do not need to remind you how unsecure this is, right? It is a very bad idea. And you can already guess the consequences of this, right? Of this sort of implementation. But let me just list down few of them. Right, so here on my screen you can see what can go wrong. Once mybudget.com has your username and password for your bank account, it can do a full impersonalization of your account. It can do whatever it wants. It can not just read the data, it can make transactions. It can transfer money from one account to another account, right? Change the details, change your personal details. It can do anything, right? And then there is single point of failure. What does that mean? Suppose if this website gets compromised, someone hacks this website, so that hacker or that person will have sensitive information of all the users who have registered on this website. That hacker will have the username and password of all the users, right? Username and password of bank accounts of all the users who have registered themselves on this website to use their services, right? So this is another very important point. And the third point is credential reuse fallout. What does this mean? So most of us are in the habit of using the same password across multiple services. So the password which you are using in our bank account, we will use the same password in our Gmail account as well, and other online services. So in this case, if suppose this website gets compromised and the hacker gets hold of all the credentials of all the users registered in the website, he can just do a hit and trial and try the passwords in other services as well, like Gmail and other online services. And sometimes in most of the cases the password might match, right? So that is also a risk that he might be able to access. Once he gets access to your bank account, he might be able to access using same password your Gmail account, right? Your email accounts. So that is another problem here. Another problem is hard to revoke. What does that mean? So once you have shared your username and password with such online services like mybudget.com, you cannot revoke it from there, right? The only way, if you want to revoke it, you have to go and change your password in this website, right? mybank.com. So that again is a hassle, right? You can't just revoke it easily. And the last point could be unauthorized data sharing, right? So when services like mybudget.com have access to your bank account, right? They don't just have access to your transactions or your account balance, right? They also have access to your personal details like your address, your phone number, your email, right? Everything. So we never know if this personal detail, are shared with other parties without our consent. We never know. So that is again a problem. Unauthorized data sharing. Your data could be shared with other services without your consent, right? So yeah, these are few of the problems which I've highlighted, but there were a lot more problems which we are not covering here, and also it doesn't make sense now to cover it because these things, this is not how currently it's implemented, right? We use rather oAuth 2.0. So just to give you an idea, I have listed down these few points to make you understand how bad an idea it was to, for systems to communicate like this with each other. Okay. Now we will understand how to implement this scenario of mybudget.com and mybank.com using oAuth 2.0, and how this implementation is much more secure compared to the previous implementation where there was no oAuth 2.0. Now in oAuth, there are a lot of flows, and the flow which we will use to understand oAuth 2.0 or to get an overview of oAuth 2.0 will be authorization code flow. So this flow which we'll talk about now is authorization code flow. Likewise, there are other flows as well, which we will slowly learn in upcoming videos. In oAuth 2.0, we have something what we call as oAuth 2.0 roles or players. So there are 4 roles in oAuth 2.0. First is resource owner, then client, then resource server, and authorization server. So these are the 4 roles. Let's see what each role means. So who is a resource owner? A resource owner is a person who owns a particular data and decides whether an app or service can use it or not. Where that data resides? That data resides in this resource server. We'll come to this later. And the app or service we are talking about is nothing but this client, which we'll talk about next. Now, what is client? Client is the app or service that wants to use the resource owner's data, and that data resides in resource server. So that is the role of client. What is authorization server? Authorization server authenticates the resource owner and issues access tokens that the client can use to access the resource owner's data from resource server. So that is the use of authorization server. And last but not the least, what is resource server? Resource server is the server where resource owner's data resides. So the resource owner data is hosted on resource server, right? So these are the 4 roles in oAuth 2.0. Now, if you notice, out of these 4 roles, the 3 roles, which is Aniket the user as resource owner, mybudget.com website as client, and mybank.com website as resource server, were also present in the previous implementation, which was done without oAuth 2.0. So if I go back to my previous diagram, this was the one, right, which we discussed earlier. So here also, if you see, Aniket, the user is there, mybudget.com is also there, and mybank.com was also there, right? But there were only 3 roles here, and it was not secure. We already We already saw this, right? Now in oAuth 2.0, a fourth role comes into picture, which was not present earlier, which is called as authorization server. And now we will understand how these four roles or how these four oAuth 2.0 players come together and helps us achieve a secure implementation. Now, how this oAuth 2.0 will work on a very high level. What would happen is Aniket, the user, will log in into the client mybudget.com, and here again he'll have some button or call to action in the same way we saw in the earlier implementation, which was without oAuth 2.0. So in mybudget.com there would be some button or call to action. For example, let's say the button could be connect to mybank.com, right? So when Aniket clicks on that button, instead of directly going to the mybank.com website, Aniket will first be redirected to authorization server. Okay, client will redirect Aniket, the user, to authorization server, and authorization server will do some validations and all. We will, learn all those things in very detail later. But authorization server will do its own validations to check the authenticity of client plus Aniket, and then it will return an, what we call as access token to client. And then client can use that access token to read Aniket's data from resource server. And that access token will have certain scopes. Now, I don't want to confuse you with these terms like scope at this point. Just understand that access token will have certain restrictions. Using that access token, client will not have full access. It will have only that level of access which Aniket permits or which has been agreed between client or authorization server. Right? So we will see all these things later. Now let's see what is the role of authorization server. All right. On a high level, these are the four roles which authorization server performs. Okay. So first one is it authenticates the resource owner. What does that mean? So when client redirects resource owner to authorization server, the first step which authorization server will do is it will authenticate the resource owner, right? So in this example, it will authenticate Aniket, which means it will somehow try to verify whether Aniket does hold a valid account in mybank.com or not, right? So authorization server will somehow try to verify that. One of the methods could be it will prompt Aniket to enter his username and password for mybank.com. And if that is correct, that means authorization server has successfully authenticated the resource owner, which is Aniket in this case. All right. So that is the first role. And the example which I gave of username and password is just one of the methods which could be used. There are many methods using which authorization server can authenticate resource owner. All right. Second, obtains consent from resource owner for the requested access. So in this example, the client, which is mybudget.com, is looking for what access? It's probably looking for transaction details of Aniket's account in mybank.com. That's what client is looking for, right? That's what mybudget.com is looking for. Using the transaction details of Aniket, mybudget.com can prepare the budget for Aniket. So it needs transaction details. It does not need any other detail apart from transaction details. It does not need, it should not ask for rather, any other details apart from transaction details. It should not ask for Aniket's mobile number or email address or address, right? It should not ask for that. So mybudget.com should only request for transaction detail. And before that can be provided to mybudget.com, a consent has to be obtained from the resource owner, right? Because resource owner is the owner of that transaction detail, right? So resource owner or Aniket in this case has to provide a consent that yes, he agrees to give this level of access, that is transaction detail records to the client, right? And that obtaining that consent right from the resource owner is also one of the roles of authorization server. All right. Third, verifies the identity of client. What does this mean? This means that authorization server cannot just provide access of this resource to any random client. The client, or rather the authorization server, must have the knowledge of client even before the client is trying to get that access. What does that mean? So in simple terms, client must be registered with authorization server even before the client is trying to access the resource. Now, how is client registered and all we will see in detail later. But what it means essentially is even before the client tries to make a request to access a resource, the client must have already registered with the authorization server. All right. And when all these three things have been verified, the last role of authorization server is it issues an access token to the client. What is access token? Access token indicates that the resource owner has granted this client permission to access some of its resources, right? That's what access token indicates. So client will use that access token to access the resource, right? Now, what is access token and how it uses it to get the access to resource, we will see in detail later, okay? So this is on a high level, 4 roles of authorization server. Now you might ask a question that authorization server and resource server are 2 different components. Then how come authorization server is able to authenticate the resource owner who has an account in resource server, right? The resource owner does not seem to have an account in authorization server. Still authorization server is able to authenticate it, right? And how come the access token which was issued by authorization server, how come client is able to use that access token to access resources from resource server, right? Because the token was issued by authorization server, then how come resource server is allowing the client to access its resources for a token which was issued by some other system, right? Which is authorization server in this case. And the reason this is possible is because in most setup, the authorization server and resource server are part of the same system or organization. So in most setup or most systems, resource server trusts the authorization server. Resource server trusts the token issued by authorization server. So there are mechanisms how resource server trusts the authorization server's token. There are mechanisms we will discuss later. You know, for example, they can share a common database wherein authorization server stores the token and resource server can extract the token, right? When client passes that token, resource server can look into their common database and see if authorization server really issued that access token. This could be one of the methods. Likewise, there are many other methods, right? And regarding this point as to how come authorization server is able to authenticate the resource owner. So the way this is possible is both systems, right? Both system, which is authorization server and resource server, in most of the setup, they usually share the same identity system, right? So there must be some system which holds the identity of users and authorization server has access to that identity system. It could be a user database, right? For example, all the user details are stored in some database and both resource server and authorization server have access to that. That is one way in which authorization server can authenticate the resource owner. Another way is authorization server itself is the identity provider. What does that mean? It itself holds the records of all the users, right? Which have accounting or which have details in this resource server. So these are the ways in which, you know, these things are possible between authorization server and resource server. In short, you can just say that authorization server and resource server work together. All right. Now, having gone through this setup of oAuth 2.0, what is the problem or what is the challenge which this setup has solved? So if you remember, if we go back to this diagram, right? So we discussed here, right, that how the systems used to communicate before oAuth 2.0. So the main problem with this setup was that Aniket as a user had to share his credentials with mybudget.com. Which credentials? His mybank.com credentials, which is this credential, right? So that was the major challenge with this setup, right? And how this challenge or problem is being solved in this setup of oAuth 2.0. So if you see here, Aniket, yes, he logs in into mybudget.com, right? But does at any point he shares his mybank.com server, sorry, mybank.com's credential to mybudget.com? Does Aniket do that in this setup? No. Why? Because as you have already seen, Aniket logs into mybudget.com in this setup, and then when Aniket clicks that call to action, mybudget.com redirects Aniket to authorization server, and Aniket will enter his credentials at authorization server. He will not enter his credential in mybudget.com. He will enter his credential here. And this part, right, authorization server is not in the purview of mybudget.com, as in MyBudget doesn't know what's happening at authorization server. So MyBudget does not know what credentials Aniket is sharing at authorization server, right? So that is how this problem is solved. So Aniket doesn't need to share his credentials with mybudget.com. Which credential? This credential, mybank.com's credential. What Aniket has to do is Aniket has to enter his mybanks.com credentials here at authorization server, not in mybudget.com. And Aniket entering his credentials at authorization server is fine because authorization server and resource server are part of same system. They work in tandem. So that will not be a problem here. Okay. So that's how this issue with the previous implementation, this implementation is being solved in this implementation, right? Which is oAuth 2.0. Now you might ask a question that if we go back to the previous implementation, right here Aniket was sharing his mybank.com credentials with mybudget.com, right? And we said that this is not a secure way of doing it because mybudget.com website can get compromised and the credentials of Aniket can get exposed, right? And when we come here, right, in oAuth 2.0, yes, Aniket is not sharing his credentials, mybank.com's credential with mybudget.com. That is correct in this setup, oAuth 2.0, but he is still sharing his credential in authorization server, right? We saw that Aniket will enter his credentials in authorization server. So you might ask a question that here also Aniket as a resource owner is sharing his credentials in authorization server. So what if authorization server gets compromised, right? So yes, that is correct. No system is perfect, and we are not saying that this setup is also 100% secure. Yes, authorization server might get compromised and the credentials might get exposed. But the thing is, companies and systems, right? Companies spend a lot of money and resources to make authorization server secure because it is meant for that purpose, right? So it has to be secure. So all the companies, will spend a lot of money and resources to make this secure. So it's very difficult to, hack it or, get the credentials out of it, right? It's very difficult. So, that is the reason that this is much more secure than the previous implementation. Also in previous implementation, Aniket, so this is one example, right, wherein Aniket is sharing his credential with mybudget.com. Likewise, Aniket might be sharing his credentials with other services as well, right? Other services like mybudget.com. So he's sharing his credential across many services. So, and the chances of his credentials getting exposed is increased here because he's sharing his credentials across many services, and those services might not be those that secure, right? So chances are getting here, the chances are more that his credentials might get exposed. So it's not just mybudget.com, right? It can be across many systems where Aniket is sharing his credentials, right? But in this setup, Aniket will be sharing credentials. Yes, in this also for different systems, he'll be sharing credentials in different systems authorization server. But each systems, right, or each setup's authorization server is much more secure than the client. So the chances is reduced that his credentials might get exposed. So yes, oAuth 2.0 is not 100% secure, but it is much more secure than the previous implementation, right? Another question might come to you that if Aniket is not sharing his credentials with mybudget.com or the client, he's sharing his credentials here, then how will client access the resource from mybank.com, right? From the resource owner, because client doesn't have the credentials. Like in previous setup, the client mybudget.com had the credentials of Aniket, so it was able to fetch details from mybank.com, right? But here since Aniket is not sharing his credentials with mybudget.com, how will mybudget.com access the resource from here, right? From the resource server? And the answer to that is access token. Okay, so once authorization server authenticates resource owner, right, and also verifies the identity of client, it issues something called access token to client, right? And that access token has information, right, which lets client use the resource from resource server. So that access token is also recognized by resource server. So resource server, when resource server looks into that access token, it can, it can verify who issued it and what is the access which resource server has to provide as part of that access token, right? So resource servers can verify that it was issued by this particular authorization server, and that token, it can verify what it contains, like what all access client is allowed to have, right? So that is a part of resource server. Resource server verifies the token and provides necessary access, right? So client doesn't use Aniket's credentials to access. Rather than that, client uses token here to access the resource from resource server, and we'll see how this token and all behave, right? And how resource server is able to read that token and all those stuff. We'll see later. Okay, now let's see an actual example of oAuth 2.0 in action. All right, so these are hypothetical examples, right? mybudget.com, mybank.com, but let's see an actual example. All right, now this is an actual example of real systems, right? You are seeing here Canva, Google Drive, right? So what are these? So in this example, resource owner will be again me, right? Aniket. I will be logged in as a resource owner into the client, right? What will be client? Client will be canva.com. All right, now what is Canva? Canva is an online design platform used to create things like presentations, social media graphics, posters, etc. Right? There are a lot of stuff which you can create using Canva. So canva.com will be acting as a client in our example, right? And then resource server will be Google Drive. That means there will be a Google Drive where Aniket will be having some resource, as in some files, okay, in Google Drive. So Aniket will have an account in Google Drive, right? And in that account, Aniket will have some files, right? And next is authorization server. So in this case, the authorization server will be Google authorization server. Okay. Now we'll see all these things in action. All right. Now for this, what I'll do is I'll use my Google Drive account. So if I go here, this is my Google Drive account. Okay, you see drive.google.com, and this Google Drive, the Gmail ID for this Google Drive is this aniket.oauth@gmail.com, right? So when I created this Gmail ID or Gmail account, I got this Google Drive along with that, right? So this is the Google Drive which I'll use, and in this Google Drive, I've uploaded one random image, right? This debug logs, right? So what is this Google Drive? This Google Drive is resource server. Who is the owner of this Google Drive, or rather, who is the resource owner? Resource owner is Aniket, right? That is me, which is nothing but owner of this account, right? Right, owner of this Gmail account. So we have resource owner, which is me, right? We have Google Drive, right? It has an image in this Google Drive, which is nothing but the resource, right? And next, we have client and authorization server. Okay. So we have seen resource owner, we have seen resource server. Next, we'll see client, which is canva.com, and later I'll also show you how Google authorization server is coming into picture. Okay. Now, if you remember, in the start of this video, I said that Aniket will have an account in resource server, plus Aniket can also have an account in client, right? So I showed you in resource server, Aniket had an account, right, using the Gmail ID, right? So Aniket's login ID is this for this Google Drive, aniket@gmail.com. Now let's go to canva.com, and there also I have a account, and it is with some other email ID, right? You can use the same email ID as well, like same Gmail ID, this Gmail ID, to create account in Canva as well. But just to keep things clear or separate, right, just to not confuse ourselves, I have created one more. I have created account in canva.com using a different email ID. Okay, so let's go to canva.com. Now let's open another window, another browser window, and I will go to canva.com. Okay, that's fine. It redirects to canva.in. That's okay. Let's log in. Okay, so you see, I already have an account in canva.com using this email ID, aniketshrivastava@hotmail.com. Okay, so I will log in using this email ID in Canva. Click on continue. It will send me a code to my email ID. Let me get that code. Just a second. Yeah. So now I have logged in canva.com as Aniket, right? So what I've done, Aniket is now logged in into canva.com, right? That's what has happened as of now. Now let's click on create. We'll just create something, some blank presentation. Okay, blank presentation, right? Now here what I want to do is I want to bring in the image which I uploaded in my Google Drive account. So let me go back there. What I want to say is, if I go here, this is my Google Drive account, right? And I uploaded an image here, right? This image. Now what I want to do is, in my Canva account, I want to bring in that Google Drive image. I want to use that image in my Canva presentation or design, right? I want to do that. So if I go back to this slide, so what I'm saying is, in canva.com, I want to access the resource or the image in my Google Drive. What it means, the client wants to access the resource in resource server, right? So that's what we are trying to do here. So let's go back to canva.com. Now let's go back to upload. I want to upload that image, right? So either you can upload from your local desktop or laptop, right? But if you go here, there is something called Google Drive. Okay, let me click on this. What it says, Google Drive wants to connect to your account. So see, there's a button called connect. So what we're trying to do, and who is logged in this account? Aniket, as you know, as in me, as in I am logged in this account. So what is happening here, guys? So if I go back here, Aniket is logged in canva.com, right? Which is the client. And here we have this button called connect. Connect to Google Drive, right? Connect to Google Drive. That means client wants to connect to Google Drive on behalf of Aniket, right? Client wants to connect to resource server on behalf of resource owner, right? So let's see. Now when I click on this connect button, what should happen? Okay, so let's go back to our previous example, the original one, this one. So if you remember, we discussed here that when Aniket logs in into the client, there should be some call to action or button, right? So this is the one, right? In this example, in Canva example, canva.com example, this is the call to action or button, right? Connect to Google Drive. And what we also said was, when Aniket clicks on that call to action button, the control will get redirected to authorization server, or in other words, client will redirect Aniket to authorization server, right? So let's see, let's click on this button. Okay, so I'll click on connect. See, some window has opened, right? You can see, what is this window? It says accounts.google.com, right? In the bar, right? So here it is, accounts.google.com. So this is nothing but Google's authorization server. This window has come up. Now authorization server has come into picture, right? What I'll do, I'll paste my email ID here first. Okay, let me just paste it here. Okay, let me maximize this. So this is the page for Google's authorization server, right? Accounts.google.com here. Okay, all right, here, this one. And there are other things as well. Ignore them for now. Okay, and let's go back to our this diagram. So right now what has happened is, client has redirected Aniket to authorization server, or if I go back to this diagram, canva.com has redirected Aniket to Google authorization server, right? So this is nothing but the page for Google's authorization server. And now let's go back. Let's go back to this example. So what is the role of authorization server, right? We have already seen the roles of authorization server. First is authenticate the resource owner. So first step is authenticate the resource owner. Who is resource owner here? Aniket, right? So Aniket is the resource owner here. And what is resource, right? So let's go back to this example, right? Aniket is a resource owner. What is resource? Resource is the image in this Google Drive, image in the resource server. We have already seen that. If I go back to this tab, this is my Google Drive tab, right? So this image is the resource in the resource server, right? And as of now, what we have seen is canva.com has redirected Aniket to Google's authorization server, right? Which is this window, right? This window. And again, going back to this original diagram. So what is the role of authorization server? So first it will authenticates the resource owner. How will it authenticate in this case? right? So let's rather copy this whole thing, right? And let's put it here. Okay, put it here somewhere so that we can refer here only. Okay, in this the actual implementation, right? What we are seeing between client canva.com and Google Authorization Server and Google Drive, right? So first is authenticate the resource owner. And how can Google Authorization Server authenticate the resource owner? The resource owner has to enter his credentials, right, for the resource server. And we know what is the credential. This is the credential. We have already seen this email ID and my password, right? So that is a credential. So now google.com is asking Aniket, the resource owner, to enter his credentials for Google Drive. That's what you're seeing here. If I go back here, right? Enter your email or phone. So I entered my Google Drive's email ID, right? Aniket oAuth@gmail.com. Next, now let's click next. I have to enter the password as well, right? I have entered the password. Click on next again. Now, what is this screen? Still we are in, in context of Google Authorization Server only. Here it is telling the user or the resource owner, that is me in this case, right? It is informing me that Google will allow Canva integrations to access this info about you. Canva will access my name and profile picture as well as my email address. So what is this part, right? Now this part is the second role has started. It obtains consent from resource owner for the requested access, right? It has started, it is taking consent from the resource owner. Who is the resource owner? I am the resource owner, right? It is taking consent from me. See, it is saying Google will allow Canva integrations to access this info about you. If I'm okay, I can click continue. If not, then I can click cancel, right? So this is first part of that consent. Now, if I click continue again, now this is important. So now what Google Authorization Server is saying, it is saying to me, right? To me as in Aniket, the resource owner, that what all Canva can access. What is Canva? Canva is your client, right? Go back to this diagram. Canva is your client. So it is again obtaining consent from me that what all Canva can access. And what is Canva trying to access here? It is saying, it is asking me, for the access, these two access. First is see and download all your Google Drive files. That is first access it is trying to access. And second is see, edit, create and delete only the specific Google Drive files you use with this app, right? So it is asking for these two access. Who is asking? Canva.com. Who is Canva? Canva is the client. So client is asking for a particular access, right, from Google Authorization Server. Access for the Google Drive, access for the resource server, right? This is second, right? Obtains consent from resource owner for the requested access. What is the requested access here? These two are the requested access, right? And it is obtaining consent from Google Authorization Server is obtaining consent from me, from Aniket as a resource owner. Okay. So if I agree to this, I can click continue. If not, I can click cancel, right? So let me click continue. Let me just select, right? Okay, I want to give that. I'm giving my consent. I as a resource owner, I'm giving my consent, right? Now, before I click continue here, I just wanted to briefly discuss one point which we have already seen. Okay, so if I go back to this diagram, right? Remember in this diagram, we discussed briefly that when Aniket logs in into client and when client redirects Aniket to authorization server and Aniket enters his credentials in authorization server, right? So client is not aware what actually is happening in authorization server, as in what credentials Aniket as a resource owner is entering in the authorization server. So if we go back to our example, right, which we are seeing here. So this, right, let me minimize this. This is the authorization server window, right? And if I open client is what? Client is Canva, right? So let me open it like this, right? So here, if you see, I'm entering, right? I'm entering my credentials, right? So just before this step, right, I entered my credential, right? Couple of steps back, I entered my Gmail ID and password. I entered in this window, right? This window, this one, right? Which I am selecting right now. So this is authorization server, right? So I entered my credentials here, right? And I'm giving my consent here. So this is outside of purview of client. And what is client? Client is in background. If I click, right, this is client Canva, right? So Canva is right now just waiting for the process at authorization server to continue. Canva is not even aware what credentials I entered in the authorization server, right? So that's how the, that's how oAuth 2.0 works, right? And we saw this point some time back, right? We discussed this. So just wanted to, highlight this in this Canva example as well. All right. Let's click continue. You see, it has redirected back to Canva. and you can see now it is able to access the image which was there in my Google Drive, right? So if you remember, in my Google Drive I have uploaded this image only. Let's go back and see. Let's go back to our Google Drive. This was my Google Drive, right? And if you remember, this was the image which I uploaded, debug logs, right? And if I go back to Canva now, Canva is able to access this image, right? This one, this image. So what has happened here, guys? If I go back to this diagram now, this one, right? So what has happened here? Now client, which is canva.com, is able to access the resource from the resource server on behalf of Aniket, which is resource owner. So canva.com was able to access the image which was uploaded in my Google Drive, right? Now you must be thinking, what about these two steps, right? Third and fourth, verifies the identity of client and issues access token. So we saw till this point, right? In the UI, obtains consent from resource owner for the requested access. So we saw till this point, but immediately after that, as soon as I provided consent, the control went back to Canva and Canva was able to access the image. So what about these two steps? So these two steps happens in background. It will not be shown in the UI, in the front end. So as soon as I provide my consent, right, in the back end, these two steps already happened. So in this example, we cannot see it because it's happening in the back end. So these two steps, right, verifies the identity of client and issues access token to the client, and client use that access token actually to get the image from Google Drive. So this happened in the back end. So that's how it is, in real implementation, that's how it works. And regarding these two steps, we will see in detail how this works, right? Even though it happens in the back end, what we'll do, we will create an oAuth setup, a pure custom oAuth setup, where we'll see each and every step happening, starting from authentication of the resource owner to all these steps, including verifying the identity of client and issuing access token, and how client is sending access token to resource server, and how resource servers, after receiving that access token, is granting access to client. So we will see all these things in our custom oAuth setup, which we'll create. Okay, so don't worry guys, we will see in detail everything. So I'll end this video here. So in this video, we saw how system used to communicate before oAuth 2.0 and how it happened after oAuth 2.0. So we saw an overview of oAuth 2.0. So I'll end this video here. In our next video, we will see in much more detail, the components of oAuth 2.0, the parameters and few more things, right? Refresh token, state, right? Redirect URI, all the things, all the technical stuff related to oAuth 2.0, and we'll do that in our custom oAuth setup. All right, so that's all for this video. We will meet in the next video.